There's so much to love about the Easter story. And within the Easter story, there are a couple of villains. And you know as well as I do that every good story has its villains. Because villains create tension within the story. It doesn't matter if it's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or if it's the Easter story. There's villains in the story. And isn't it true that when you watch the story, come on, you've read the Easter story how many times? You've seen movies how many times? And you know who the villain is in the story. And every time you watch the movie, you're talking to the TV set. No, don't listen to him. No, don't go in there. No, he's behind the door. I mean, you just know. You know how it's going to turn out, but you watch it anyway because the villains create the tension in the story, which makes it exciting. And the same thing is true with the Easter story. There's a villain in the Easter story. And we get emotionally involved every time we read this story. And so the villains are there. And when you read about the villains in the Easter story, you can't be too critical. Because there's certain character traits and certain qualities about the villains that we can also find in all of us this morning. There's just something in them. Including the character that we're going to talk about today. The character that we're going to talk about today, last week we talked about Caiaphas. He was a high priest. He should have known better. The high priest is this guy that should have been in touch and in tune with God. But he tried to leverage God, manipulate God. He tried to usurp God's authority. He tried to resist God. And we found out that the more you try to resist God, the more you just kind of end up just kind of fulfilling the will of God, which is what Caiaphas did. And the character in our story today is a guy who wanted to bargain with Jesus. I'm just kind of curious today, how many of you, including myself, come on, how many of you have ever bargained with God? Anybody ever bargained with God? Come on, you prayed the prayer and it sounded something like this. If you, then I, right? If you, then I. We've all tried to bargain with God. One of the ways we bargain with God is this. I'll give God what I think God wants from me in order to get from God what I want from Him. In other words, if I push all the buttons in the right sequence and pull all the levers, then I should get from God what I want. And so we try to bargain with God that way. I'll just try to leverage God, manipulate God so I can get from God something that I want. Or maybe here's another way you've bargained with God. If God holds up His end of the bargain, I'll hold up my end of the bargain. And so we kind of put God to the test. We put God to the task. God, all right, here's what I want. And if you follow through, then I promise I will. Or I will never again. Or maybe since God, and this is some of you in this place today, since God didn't behave the way I thought He should behave, I don't have to behave the way God wants me to behave. See, people walk through life oftentimes hurt because circumstances didn't turn out the way they hoped. They bargained with God, and God, please don't let her die. Please don't let her leave me. Please don't let this happen. And because this happened, and you didn't hold up your end of the bargain, I'm going to bail. I'm just done. And people walk through life angry at God. And that's the villain of our Easter story this morning. The villain of our Easter story says, God didn't behave the way I thought He should behave, and so I'm not going to behave the way He wants me to behave. And because of that, the villain of our story just bailed on Jesus. And the villain that we're going to talk about today, you've read about him, you've heard about him, his name is Judas. Now, we read in the Gospels, we read about the life of Jesus. There were 12 guys that were really close to Jesus. We call them the disciples. There was hundreds that would follow Jesus wherever He went. Remember, wherever Jesus went, there was a crowd. Naturally, there was a crowd because miracles happened. There was hope where Jesus was. Life was different wherever Jesus was present. But the 12 were the disciples, the ones, and remember, a disciple was not to know what the teacher knew. It was to become as the teacher was. And that was the intent. Jesus is the itinerant rabbi. A rabbi was just a teacher. So He gathers these 12 men around Him so that they can become as He is, to really represent Him so well wherever they go. And one of those 12 One of those 12, his name was Judas Iscariot. And you understand that all of the lives of these 12 men were directly affected positively by following Jesus. I mean, you can think of some of the guys were fishermen. We don't know the vocations of all the men that were there, but some of them were fishermen. Now, come on, I could think of a lot of reasons to walk away from fishing. Are you with me on that one? But these guys walked away from fishing to follow Jesus. As a result, their lives were completely changed. One of them, his name is Matthew. He writes, in fact, we're going to read some of Matthew today. Matthew, his name was Levi. He was a tax collector. I mean, how many people love tax collectors? And suddenly, Levi is called by Jesus. He starts to follow him, and his life is impacted. All of them were positively influenced by that. But even though these guys are walking with Jesus, we see little vignettes in their interaction with Jesus that I think represent how you and I could feel sometimes. Let me give you just a quick example how their attitude can be like our attitude, or our attitude can be like their attitude. One of the stories that we read about in the Gospels is about this guy who had a whole bunch of money, and he's young, and he finds out where Jesus is, and he runs up to Jesus, and he goes, Master, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? In other words, I want to inherit eternal. I want to be right with you and right with God. And Jesus says, well, you know the commandments, right? Don't murder. Obey your parents. Don't lie, cheat, steal, all that kind of stuff. And he says, I've done all of that stuff. And Jesus says, there's one thing you lack. Remember, this guy's really rich. He says, one thing you need to do. You need to sell all your possessions and then take that money and give it to the poor. And the guy walks away sad because he was really rich. We don't know the outcome. We don't know what he did with the command of Jesus. And then right after Jesus says that, listen to what Peter, one of the guys that was so close to Jesus, listen to what Peter says in Matthew 19:27. We'll put it on the screen for you. Right after Jesus says that, Peter says to Jesus, look, we gave up everything to follow you. We gave up everything to follow you. What are we going to get? And you know, that's the mindset of a lot of people. Come on, if you want me to be a follower of Jesus, Pastor, come on. It's Sunday morning, and week by week you're always asking me to be a follower of Jesus, to surrender my life to Jesus. All right, what's in it for me? We want to know what's in it for us. What do we get out of this whole thing? Because if we don't get what we expect to get, in other words, I'll walk with Jesus for a while. I'll hold up my end of the bargain. But if Jesus doesn't come through somewhere, when there's a pinch, when there's a crisis, when there's a need, I'm done. I'll just bail. I'll just walk away from the whole thing. And that's exactly what happened to Judas. Let's read the background of Judas a little bit. And the story begins a little bit before this. I'm going to read to you out of Matthew chapter 26, a story that maybe you've heard before. Look at this story. In Matthew 26:6, it says that Jesus was in Bethany. That's really key there, because he's going to go back to Bethany. Bethany's like a suburb of Jerusalem. It's about 1.5 miles away. And while he's there, he's at the home of a guy named Simon, a man who had previously had leprosy. I mean, previously had leprosy. You didn't previously have leprosy unless Jesus touched you, because once you were diagnosed with leprosy, that was it. And so he's had an interaction with Jesus, has Jesus over in gratitude to have him there for a meal. Look what goes on during the meal. Verse number 7. While he was eating, they're reclining at a table. He's leaning on his elbow. Laying on his side next to the table, a woman came with a beautiful alabaster jar of expensive perfume, and she poured it over his head. This jar was made of alabaster. In fact, you'd have to break the neck. It was thin at the neck. You'd break the neck of that jar because it was completely sealed, this perfume. So she snaps it, she breaks it, and then she takes the contents inside and she starts to pour it over his head. How many are already ooh at this point? Like, no way, don't pour nothing on my head. Like, I have $50 shampoo. Don't put no oil in my head, right? This was in the culture, this was so honoring. In verse number 8, the disciples, though, they were indignant. Do you know what indignant means? They were ticked. They were angry when they saw this. What a waste, they said. Now, it's interesting. Matthew was an eyewitness to this. Matthew was there. But he says, they said. Now, I'm thinking maybe one or two. In fact, one of the other gospel writers said Judas was probably the one that speaks up. The others were thinking it, but Judas is the one who speaks it. And he was kind of annoyed by this whole act because Judas, you see, he was the treasurer for the disciples and Jesus. And one of the gospel writers says, regularly he pilfered money. He took money out of the offering plate to go buy stuff he wanted to buy. So they're mad about this whole thing. Verse number 9. You know what? Here's why we're mad. Verse number 9. You know what? That perfume could have been sold at a high price and the money could have been given to the poor. One of the other gospel writers says that the dollar amount for that perfume, it would take a whole year's wages to pay for the perfume that this woman poured over the head of Jesus. Let me ask you a question. Let's say the average income of Williston is $50,000 a year. Do you think it would be a waste to take $50,000 perfume and pour it over the head of Jesus? If you think that's too much, let's go half. $25,000. Is that still too much to pour over the head of? That's way too much. Let's go $12,500. Is that still too much to sacrifice to pour over the? Okay, let's just drop that to $6,000. Is that still too much to sacrifice to pour something over the head of Jesus? How much? How much before you think it would be a waste? Verse number 10. Jesus, aware of what they're thinking, he says this, why are you criticizing this woman for doing such a good thing to me? In other words, you know what? This is her perfume. Let her do with it what she wants to do. Why are you guys so bothered by this whole thing? And then Jesus says something that we've maybe heard before, something we know in verse number 11. He says, look, you will always have the poor amongst you. Is that a true statement? Say yes. Yes. But you will not always have me. In other words, for the rest of your life, poor people are going to be around you all the time. I'm just here for a little bit longer. They didn't understand this. They didn't really yet comprehend the whole thing about the death and the resurrection of Jesus. That hadn't sunk in yet. Verse number 12, she has poured this perfume on me to prepare my body for burial. That would have been like, what do you mean for burial, Jesus? You're only like 33. You got years to live. But he's prophesying. He's telling them in advance what's going to happen to them. And then a huge, I think just a huge statement. Look, you might question the validity of the Bible. I don't know if you're watching us online. You go, well, you know, pastor's always preaching from the Bible. And, you know, how can you know that that stuff isn't made up and that whole kind of thing? Look what Jesus says in verse number 12. This is 13. I tell you the truth, Jesus says, wherever the good news or the gospel or the Bible is preached, even Williston, North Dakota, throughout the whole world, this woman's deed will be remembered and discussed. Isn't it amazing that more than 1,900 years later, that in any church around the world, we're still talking about the story that Jesus said we would talk about? And we're talking about it here this morning. I don't know what your contact or interaction is with the church, but I bet you've heard this story before, probably in a Sunday school class or vacation Bible school class. And then this little story turns a little darker in verse number 14. Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, he leaves supper, and he goes to the leading priests, including the guy that we talked about last week, Caiaphas. And you'll see why Judas goes to the leading priests. I think at this point, Judas has been hanging out with Jesus long enough. I've been with him for more than 3 years, and I'm just sick of the way Jesus deals with people and deals with life. And Jesus, you're just not getting the agenda here. You keep asking us to follow you. Jesus, we've got other stuff going on in life. And I think at this point, Judas is absolutely fed up with the ministry of Jesus because he was not getting from Jesus what he expected to get from Jesus. And so he goes to the leading priests. Look what he says in verse 15. He says to the priests, how much will you pay me to betray Jesus to you? And they gave him 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver. He was all upset just a moment ago because this woman spent a year's wages with this alabaster jar of perfume and anointing the head of Jesus. Now he's willing to sell out for 30 pieces of silver. The experts estimate that was about $17, the price of a slave at the time of Jesus. He's willing to sell out and betray Jesus for $17. He's willing to sell out for the price of a slave. How much is Jesus worth to you when you don't get what you want? In one moment when you need something from Jesus, he's everything. And when you don't get what you want, you just turn your back on him. What's the price of our sacrifice? That's a question for us. Verse 16 says, from that time on, after he gets 30 pieces of silver, Judas began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus. An opportunity. It was hard to do anything with Jesus. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, they tried to do something with Jesus, but wherever he went, there was always a crowd of people. And if we try to take him out of the crowd and arrest him, there's going to be an insurrection. The Romans are going to get involved. The army is going to get involved. We just want this done quietly. Nobody to know about this whole thing. Judas knew that. Now he's looking for a prime opportunity to turn Jesus over to the hands of those that wanted his life. Not long after this, Passover comes. The Jews today still celebrate Passover. It begins this Friday. It'll go for roughly a week. It ends on the 27th. It's a Friday in this story that we're reading here. Jesus, along with the 12, it's a Passover meal at the upper room. And Jesus finds an intimate moment to be alone with just his 12. There's no crowds now. There's just him and the 12. And he's there in the upper room with them, and they start to eat a meal. And there they are at that Passover meal in the upper room. And Jesus does something amazing. He takes off his rabbi robe. Jesus would have had some sort of a garment that covered his whole body, but then there was a square cloth that he would have worn that would have been kind of diagonal in the front, diagonal in the back, and would have had tassels around it. That's what the rabbis wore, the teachers. And he takes off this rabbi garment. And he wraps a towel around his waist. And you know the story. You can read it in John. And he starts to wash the feet of the disciples. And he does this to say, you know what, let me show you what it means to love people. And when you think you're too good to do this, you need to put on a towel and do this. He gets done washing their feet, and he sits down and finishes the meal with his 12 disciples. And when he sits down, he says, guess what, guys? One of you is going to betray me. They all start looking at each other. Who, me? No way, not me, couldn't be. And in John chapter 13, verse number 6, Jesus now makes it really clear who's going to betray him. He said, it is the one to whom I give this bread that I dip in the bowl. And then when he had dipped it, he gives it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. There's no question now about who's going to betray him. You can't get too critical of Judas here because ultimately all the disciples betrayed him. And you'll see that in a moment as we keep reading the story. But it was Judas who was the one who spearheaded the whole thing. Verse number 27 of that same chapter, when Judas had eaten this bread, Satan entered into him. We don't know what this looks like. He eats the piece of bread that Jesus hands him, and suddenly the heart, the gateway, the door of Judas's heart becomes open to something more powerful and dark than he'd ever encountered in his life. I don't think he laid on the floor and frothed at the mouth and his eyes rolled back in the head, but something transitioned in the heart of Judas. And then Jesus told him, Judas, hurry up and go do what you're going to do. Now, none of the other disciples understood what Jesus meant by that. Since Judas was one who kept the money, they assumed, as John says, that he was just going to go buy some more food. And so Judas gets up and he leaves the rest. They think he's just off to run an errand for Jesus. And during the meal, somebody maybe made the suggestion, hey, when we're done with supper, let's go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Let's just have some time to pray and to worship God with the rabbi. Now remember, wherever Jesus went, there were crowds. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's no crowd. And Judas was looking, remember, for an opportunity to betray Jesus. And I think when he got up from the table, he went, now would be the time. It's nighttime. Everybody's at home except for Jesus and us. And they're going to go hang out in the Garden of Gethsemane. And so he walks back to Jerusalem from the place where they're having this meal. Judas has about a half an hour, however long it takes you to walk a mile and a half, to think about what he is about to do with Jesus. And he rolls this over and over in his mind. He's got all of this time to think. And he arranges a plan with the religious leaders. Come on, you can see this. You can see this. Judas gets into where the religious leaders are. Hey, guys. I know the perfect time and opportunity. Look. He's going to the Garden of Gethsemane right now with some of the disciples. This would be the prime opportunity to go and arrest him. Now, it's going to be dark, obviously, in the garden. So I will give you a sign. There's going to be Jesus. There's going to be 11 other guys. So if no mistake about this, bring your torches along with you. And when we get there, so there's no mistake, I will walk up to Jesus, the one you're supposed to arrest, and I will give him a kiss on the cheek, customary to the Orient culture. At this point, Judas thinks the worst that can happen to Jesus is, you know what? He's going to get maybe beaten up a little bit. He's going to get questioned. He's going to get tried. Maybe he'll be put in prison. But that's the worst that would happen to Jesus. But as the story plays out, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, now understand this, Jesus at this point is in the hands of the Jewish officials. Jews did not have the power to carry out capital punishment. Judas turns him over to the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders are under the umbrella of a Roman government. They couldn't do any capital punishment to Jesus unless the Roman government gets involved. Now, suddenly, a guy named Pontius Pilate's involved, and Judas realizes, oh, this is going way worse than I thought it was going to be. And in Matthew 27:3, when Judas, who had betrayed him, realized that Jesus had been condemned to die, he was filled with remorse, and so he took the 30 pieces of silver back to the leading priests and the elders. Look what he says in verse number 4. I've sinned, you guys, for I have betrayed an innocent man. And then look at their response. So profound. He's coming to the priests who dealt with the sins of humanity. He's coming to the priests. People would bring their sin sacrifice, their sin offering to the priest to offer it before God. Judas is coming back going, I've sinned, you guys. And look at their response. What do we care? That's your problem. You know why we bargain with God? Because we don't trust him. You know, we work so hard to preserve our agenda, like Judas. We work so hard to preserve our life, our habits, our free time, our selfishness. And then because we're working so hard to preserve what we want in our life, we create a problem. And some of you are sitting here today, some of you are watching online, and you have a problem. In fact, what keeps you up at night, what keeps you from drifting off to sleep at night is because every time you lay your head on the pillow and you don't have a screen in front of you, you don't have something in your ears, you don't have something going on in your life, you got to think about your problem. Because the problem came because you were trying to solve your problems. You were trying to fulfill your agenda. You didn't want to surrender and trust to God. And as a result, you made your own problem. And when you don't trust God, you deal with your own problems. Listen, when you don't trust God, you deal with your own problems. Judas didn't trust Jesus. He created his own problems. But when you start to trust God, he deals with your problems. Verse number 5. Judas threw the silver coins down in the temple, and he went out, and he hanged himself. And the hanging in those days wasn't like we think of hanging today. It was to impale yourself on a spike that stuck out of the ground. 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver. That's how much Judas' selfishness was worth to him. How about you or somebody that you know? How much is your selfishness worth? What are you willing to try to preserve at the cost? What are you willing to preserve at the cost of being full on with a relationship with Jesus. Come on. I'm talking to even people here that would profess to be believers. I mean, Jesus has like 98% of your heart, but there's still that 2% you want to hang on to. You still want to be in control of a little bit. Maybe there's no relationship with Jesus. And you know why there's no relationship with Jesus? Because you don't trust him with your unforgiveness. You know what? If I say yes to Jesus, that means that I got to do something about this anger that I feel about somebody else. And I just know because what I heard about God, what I know about God, if I start a relationship with him, he's going to tell me that I have to let this go, and he's going to deal with them, and I got to turn around. And I don't want to deal with him. I want to deal with him because I've been hurt. I'm angry. So I'm not just going to go there with God because God will let them off the hook, and they don't deserve to be let off the hook. You know what? Maybe it's a relationship. There's a relationship you're in right now, and you're going to stick with that relationship. I'm not going to give up that relationship because I can't see God, but I can see him. I can see her. It's the unwillingness to change. It's the habit that you don't want to let go, because if I start to follow Jesus, now I got to do something about this. He's going to want me to give up something that I've become so familiar with, yet I'm so miserable about. Maybe it's anger. To say yes to Jesus means I got to deal with this anger, and I don't want to deal with it. I want to be an angry person. Maybe it's the self-pity that you feel. You know what? If I say yes to Jesus, he's going to start to mess around with stuff in my heart, stuff in my past. And I don't want him to deal with that, so I just want to leave it the way it is. I'll just hold back. Just trust God to help you with your problems. Because if you don't, you're left to deal with your problems. And so you say, Pastor, what do you want me to do? I just want you to surrender to God without any kind of conditions. And here's why. Because God surrendered his son to you without any conditions. Look, if you want to bargain with God, you can bargain with God, but you'll come up disappointed every single time. But when you start to trust God, it's amazing what God will do in your life. But you got to trust this unseen God and understand that he's got a plan and he will work it out. Would you just surrender to him and put no conditions on the relationship with him, because he hasn't put any conditions on your relationship